listener to the Campfirecult From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. Welcome back, campers, to our final episode for a couple of months. We'll be returning on October 31st for our Halloween special and several other episodes that will take us clear through the end of the year. But don't worry, during the break, I plan to have several Patreon-only episodes to get you by until we return. Tonight, we delve into the heart of the haunted forest, where we'll find secrets older than time itself. Our tales tonight will center around a creature whispered about around campfires and feared by those who dare to wander deep into the wilderness. The enigmatic not deer. Described as standing on spindly legs that bend unnaturally as if it has too many joints, eyes that are set in front of its head like a predator rather than prey, giving off an uncanny feeling of intelligence, the not deer prowls the moonlit woods, leaving a trail of unease in its wake. Locals speak of an unsettling presence, a wrongness that grips them when the not deer is seen. Join us as we uncover chilling encounters of this otherworldly being, exploring the thin veil between the known and the unknown. Prepare yourself, for once you've heard these stories, you may never look at a deer in your yard the same way, ever again. Let's dive into the first story of the evening, where a 13-year-old wandering through the forest at night near Goose Creek, South Carolina, encounters a mysterious creature.
I only ran into this thing once, and that was about a mile away from my house on a gravel road that cut through some forests, fields, and goes right near Goose Creek, South Carolina. I couldn't have been more than 13 at the time. I walked the forest and deer paths all the time and had encountered everything from a swarm of bats to an angry fox, and even some drunk guys peeing on everything, but oddly, had never felt threatened before. It was strange because I felt off and watched in a place I usually considered to be more my home than my own bedroom. The moon was high in the sky and swollen with light, so I could clearly see the forest around me. But the feeling came from everywhere at once, all around me. I was on edge and only had a small knife with me, but I took it out. My entire being was screaming that someone, not something, was there, and they intended to hurt me. I wanted to run as fast as I could back to my house, but something stopped me from walking further or sprinting off. Some sense that if I passed a specific point in the trees, I wouldn't survive. From that exact point on the trail, the thing walked out from between a cluster of trees that should have been too close together for them to walk through. What was strange to me was, even though I felt threatened, it felt like this deer-like thing was part of the forest itself. It had giant branching antlers, the kind you never see in real life because they get broken during mating season or the bucks get shot during hunting season. They seemed more like crowns or swords than anything else. And these monstrous antlers were getting bigger because this deer-like creature, that in no way really resembled a deer other than its shape, and my inability to better match it to a known creature, was shambling towards me. It was huge and walked similar to an animated drawing. Choppy is the only way I can describe its movements. My first instinct was to fight it. I was already palming my knife despite knowing exactly how the fight would end with me wishing I was dead. I was ready to fight, but something stopped me. I have no idea what it was exactly, but something reminded me of all my other experiences I had in these same woods, and how every other time, it turned out okay when I let the forest wrap around me, so to speak, and just accept my situation. And that's what I did. I mentioned earlier that the deer thing felt like part of the forest, enraged and viscous, but still familiar. It was an insane experience, and to this day I don't think I've felt the kind of pure hatred that I did in that moment ever again. It was like someone had hijacked my emotions and just turned spite, disgust, hate, and rage up to 100 and everything else down to 0, but only for a split second. The moment I felt that swell of emotions start to ebb, the thing stopped coming towards me. We just looked at each other while I struggled to breathe after having every negative feeling shoved through me. And it left, just ambled away into the trees and bushes and left me to continue my walk home. I did go out at night on the very same trail, just wandering through the forest many nights after that though. That was the only time I ever saw the deer-like thing. but it wasn't the last time I felt its eyes on me, watching and judging me to see if I'm worthy, if I've changed enough that I'm no longer worthy of the life it let me keep. I used to feel like I was a part of the forest, and I think that kept me safe. But I've been living in the city now for over 5 years. If I go back, I doubt I would walk those paths alone at night again. I'm not sure if the forest still has a claim on me. I'm not sure if the thing will still find me worthy of living.
Next, in 2014, a newspaper delivery driver in Northeast Arkansas encounters an unsettling presence on a desolate back road.
This happened to me in January 2014, on a back road in Northeast Arkansas. At the time, I was a newspaper delivery driver. I picked up my papers from the press usually at 12:15 a.m., and it was a 45-minute drive to start my route. At the time, I was a cigarette smoker, so after I bagged up enough newspapers to sustain my route for a while, I'd light up a cigarette and roll the window down. Being cold, I tried to keep it up as much as possible, because my car back then didn't have heat or AC. There's a really long stretch of gravel road called Old Military Road near Harrisburg, Arkansas. On the left side of the road are mostly houses, and on the right are fence posts and open pasture, with barns and troughs for horses and cows. It is in the middle of nowhere, though. There are no street lights, but some people have floodlights in their yard. I'm driving along with my windows down smoking a cigarette. It's about 2:30 a.m. and I begin smelling a combination of burning hair and urine. Like not a mixture of the two, but one and also the other. It isn't a great smell. I toss the cigarette and roll my window up, but can still smell whatever this awful smell is. The further I go down the road, the worse the smell gets. Usually see some of the cows sleeping outside or horses chilling sometimes, but nothing tonight. So I know that I'm not the only one who picked up on something being weird that night. As I'm coming up to a fork in the road, I have to take the left. There is a big open field to the far right, and I see what looks like a man with a deer's head. It was too dark for me to tell whether it was a man wearing a deer skull or an actual human deer cross, but it was definitely the source of whatever the smell was. It scared the heck out of me, and I didn't want to hang out long enough to figure out exactly what it was. To my perception, he was around 8 feet tall. The head probably added a foot of height, I don't know, but he was massive. They were definitely deer antlers, and the smell was disgusting. I saw him stretch his arms. Imagine flexing your arms and chest by making a wide C with your arms. His movement for the 2 to 3 seconds I saw him looked to be human. I never saw it again because I found a new job in late January and started in February. After that, I was not interested in ever being out in that area again.
Coming up next, in the fall of 2017, a man had an encounter with an entity resembling a human with a deer-like head.
In the fall of 2017, I had a strange encounter. I was sitting on the patio in the backyard, having a cigarette and some drinks while talking to my friend on the cell phone. It was around 10 at night, and the darkness enveloped the yard, which sloped steeply down to the lake. The area was dense with woods and thick brush. Suddenly, I heard something rushing through the yard, tearing through the thick brush. I exclaimed, "What was that?" And my friend asked, "What?" I replied, "I don't know, something just ran through the yard." It was sizable, and I couldn't understand why it chose that path instead of the open space by the lake. I thought it was a deer, although I hadn't seen deer in that spot before. Anyway, I brushed it off and continued chatting with my friend. Later, I heard a noise near the dock. I thought maybe kids were playing there. For some reason, I rushed towards the stairs leading to the dock. As I reached the top of the steep stairs and looked down, I saw something running up towards me. I was in shock. Whatever this was, it looked like a person with a deer head. It had a human body and was sprinting up the stairs unbelievably fast, staring directly at me with red eyes. It ran right up to me, maintaining eye contact, came close and uttered something, about 4 or 5 syllables, rapidly. I couldn't understand the words, but it felt like words. Then it ran past me, inches away because the stairway was only 4 feet across. Some friends suggested that it might be a person in a costume, but I insisted it moved too fast, almost like it was in a different dimension. I believe it was a being with a human body and a deer head. The antlers were spindlier than those of the local deer, with way more branches. The next night, standing at the top of the stairs in the dark, I felt uneasy and challenged myself, but decided not to walk down to the dock. Over the summer, I slept on the dock, and one night at 2:30 a.m., I heard something large crashing in the woods, followed by deer-like snorting. I stayed still, not daring to investigate though, and it soon passed. After that night, nothing more occurred.
Next up, after staying late at school for a basketball game in Roanoke, West Virginia, a woman has an unsettling encounter with a mysterious humanoid deer in a dark church parking lot.
It was 2 months ago in 2022. I stayed after school one late December afternoon in the Roanoke, Virginia area for a basketball game. After the game, I walked to the nearby church lot waiting for my dad. It was already dark. As I stood waiting, I felt like someone or something was watching me. I turned around and saw the shadow of a man behind a bush. I instantly ran to the other side of the street. I caught my breath and slowly walked back to the other side of the church where I would be able to see my dad drive up. As I stood there, keeping an eye out for my dad and for other shadows, I saw 2 deer along the edge of the woods. I put some space between me and the deer, and I watched the deer as they began to move around. I watched closely as one of the deer seemed to have a bad back leg or was injured. I began to walk in the direction of the deer in order to get a better look. When I came within 20 feet or so of the deer, I stopped. I was literally frozen and terrified at the same time. I realized that these were not deer. They both had oddly shaped heads with patches of hair that seemed to be stitched onto their bodies. It actually looked like human skin was underneath the patches. Then both deer looked in my direction and slowly stood up, on their back legs. They then started to run in my direction, chasing me back to the church lot. I was yelling and running at the same time, so loud that my dad heard me a block away. I ran towards my home neighborhood, but my dad happened to see me and caught up. As he stopped ahead of me, I jumped into the passenger seat yelling, "Go, go!" He asked me what the hell was I yelling and running for. I couldn't answer him. I was absolutely freaked out. The 10-minute drive home was surreal as I was thinking about what I had experienced and what I was going to tell my dad. When we got home and after I calmed down a bit, my mom and dad sat at the dining room table with me and listened to my description of the encounter. They actually listened. They knew by my demeanor that something had really occurred. Later that night, while I was in my room watching television, my dad came into my room and wanted to talk. He told me about an encounter that he had several years prior with a deer while he and my uncle were hunting in the nearby mountains. His description was very much like mine. He had told my mom about it at the time, and now I know why they didn't question my sanity when we talked. We still don't know exactly what we saw, but hope to never encounter them again.
Next, while investigating reports of a mysterious and potentially diseased deer in the Kettle Moraine State Forest, a Wisconsin DNR employee finds himself in an encounter with a grotesque creature that defies explanation.
While working for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources in 2017, I was assigned to investigate sightings of a particular deer in the South Kettle Moraine State Forest along the Ice Age National Scenic Trail. The description suggested that the deer suffered from chronic wasting disease, CWD, with 3 different reports indicating that the deer was malnourished, severely injured, and had a terrible odor. My first thought was that the deer had been wounded, and gangrene had probably set in. The part of the trail where the deer was reported was difficult to access with a vehicle, so I ended up hiking, reaching the shelter just as a thunderstorm began to roll in. The sightings were near one of the public shelters, and the most recent report was made about 24 hours prior. I looked around quickly for the deer, but the rain started to fall heavily, and I decided to wait it out in the shelter. The shelters in this area of the park are more like little cabins, used by backpackers, and as I took off my backpack and sat down, I was soon overcome by the stench of rotting flesh. The odor came out of nowhere, and was so strong that I was nearly gagging. I looked around the interior of the shelter to find the source, and then I thought I saw something move past the doorway. When I peeked outside, there was nothing, and the stench disappeared as quickly as it had manifested. I waited in the shelter for another 30 minutes. The storm hadn't let up, but the stench suddenly returned. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew there was something terribly wrong, even though I couldn't explain how I knew. Then I heard something scrape against the side of the shelter, and it was loud. I looked out through the window and saw what looked to be white antlers. Even though it was early summer in Wisconsin, bucks don't start growing their antlers until much later in the season. This must be the injured deer, and it smelled like it was on death's door. I tried to get a better look out the window, but the animal appeared to be moving towards the door of the shelter. Whatever it was, I was about to see it soon enough. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about this whole situation. I removed the gun, a 12-gauge shotgun with slugs I'd packed in to dispatch the deer. I pointed it at the door and waited. The creature that walked into view wasn't an old injured deer. It was about twice the size of a full-grown male whitetail, and its body was skeletal, with long, stringy fur and parts missing fur completely. The worst part was that its head was a skull with no hair, no skin, just bone with the antlers attached. I didn't see any eyes in its sockets, but I could see it had a tongue in its jaw, and its teeth looked like those of a deer. The lower jaw didn't appear to be hanging on by much. It stood there in that dark, rain-soaked doorway before I fired at it. I hit that creature 3 times center mass, but it didn't fall down or falter a step. It just ran. I waited another hour for the storm to pass before hiking out of there, never having been so scared in my life. If a shotgun couldn't stop it, there was nothing I could do if I ran into it again. Finally, when I reached my truck, I had no idea what to report to my boss. I eventually decided to report that I never observed the deer, thinking that reporting the truth would raise red flags about my competence.
Real quick, if you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other full Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. And finally, if you don't mind, please share, rate, and review wherever possible. Now, back to the show. Next up, this one is short but impactful. I can't imagine seeing what this woman saw on a routine late-night trip to a local convenience store in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania.
I drove to a local convenience store here near Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, in Monroe County to pick up something to eat. My dog was with me, and it was just before midnight. Everything was normal on the way there, but on the way back, something weird happened. As I approached a stop sign outside of town, my dog started growling. My dog rarely growls, so when he does, I take notice. I looked around and saw a deer walking toward the road from behind a large oak tree. The deer then stepped out onto the road, about 50 feet from me, but then the deer started to walk toward the headlights of my car. As it got closer, I began to see its face much clearer. At first, I literally shook my head a bit in disbelief. Then I did a double take. The deer had a freaking human face. There was no elongated nose, no big dark eyes. It was a freaking person's face. The eyes had white surrounding dark blue-colored pupils and were forward-setting, looking directly at me. I just froze. I don't even remember if my dog was growling at this point. I was truly scared by what I was witnessing. It kept looking at me for almost a minute. Then it turned and slowly walked to the other side of the road and then walked off into the woods. I stepped on the gas and got the heck out of there. When I got home, I immediately went inside my house and poured a stiff drink. I needed to know what I saw and went online. I stayed up most of the night looking for an explanation for what I had witnessed. I read a few other accounts of what people referred to as not deer, but nothing as dramatic as what I saw. Could it be the results of an experiment that went wrong?
Coming up, during a break, a guard at a base in Quantico, Virginia, decides to venture into the woods, only to have a surreal and unsettling run-in with a deer exhibiting very strange behaviors.
I remember that day vividly. It was during a break, and I decided to venture into the woods to check on one of the game cameras I had set up. Those cameras were my way of keeping an eye out for trespassers and poachers in the area. As I made my way through the trees, just a few feet off the road, an eerie silence settled over the woods, making me uneasy. Reaching the creek where the camera was placed, I set up my laptop by a tree to check the footage. Within minutes, I started hearing the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Assuming it was a person, I scanned the area, only to be greeted by the sight of a magnificent white-tailed deer stepping out of the foliage. I thought to myself, that's so weird. The thing that really threw me off was how it went from sounding like a human walking on two legs to then seeing a deer. The deer, however, started exhibiting strange behavior. It walked over to a large oak tree adjacent to the clearing and, to my horror, began violently smashing its face into the tree. The sound of bones cracking and grunting filled the air. There have been very, very few times in my life that I was frozen in fear, and that was one of them. When something's in pain, it makes sounds. Deers have a dying grunt, but there's no grunting. There's no sound of something trying to kill itself. The only sound is just this repeated smashing of bone over and over. I suspected it might be suffering from chronic wasting disease, but what happened next defied all rational explanations. The deer, after finishing its bizarre display, stood up on its hind legs and spoke with the clearest voice I had ever heard and said,
"I know you're there."
I felt freaked out. I was scared. I struggled to comprehend how a creature with a shattered jaw and no voice box could speak. I was frozen in time, like somebody put me in jello and I couldn't react. I felt like I had been watching it for hours, but it was probably just 5 to 10 seconds. Then it dropped back down on all fours and walked back into the brush. Terrified, I dropped my laptop and ran back to my vehicle, leaving the bizarre scene behind. A month later, I returned for my laptop and the camera. The thing that kind of threw me off about it, after being in the woods, exposed to the elements, my laptop should have been grungy and covered in leaves, but it wasn't. It was like I just left it there 20 minutes ago. The thing that made my stomach absolutely drop is that when I looked down, there was splinters of bone and antler. I picked up one of the splinters and felt it in my hand. It was real. I couldn't believe it. It was nice to know I wasn't insane. This was solid evidence. Since then, I've chosen not to return to that spot, supernatural or not.
Next, a skeptic of paranormal phenomena recounts an encounter with a mysterious upright creature on Route 30 in Northborough, Massachusetts in 2007.
I want to start off by saying that I do not really believe in strange creatures from the abyss, and I am not a huge fan of looking for Bigfoot. I am just a regular girl who saw something that I can't explain. I just want to know if this is something that maybe someone else has seen. I was driving down Route 20 in Northborough, Massachusetts at around 2 a.m. one night in 2007. My girlfriend at the time was in the car with me. When we reached a more wooded area, I saw two animals crossing the road. Both of them stopped and turned to look at my oncoming car. When I saw them, I turned on my high beams, thinking they were deer. After a brief moment, they both took about 2 steps and cleared the road, and were in the woods. I looked at my girlfriend, who looked back at me and said, "Did you see that? Those were not deer." We made a few jokes about it and ended up calling them the things on Route 20. They had fur on them that was the length of a deer, really short, except the fur was black. Height would be about 7 feet tall without counting the height of their antlers. Their eyes were reflective, like when a cat looked at you from the dark. The head was deer-like, but here's the thing that was way off. They were standing upright on their back legs like a human would, casually walking across the street. I'm no expert when it comes to deer, but does anyone know if this is common? The whole scene had a very uncanny valley feeling to it. Like we just slipped into another dimension, where animals walking on 2 legs was commonplace.
Coming up next, in the quiet expanse of Florida's countryside, a man observes a deer with an unsettling gaze and uncanny valley type of appearance.
I live in Florida out in the country. There's about 500 acres of wooded area around my house, with some clearings for other houses and cows. While we live fairly close to the main road, it's far enough back that we don't hear traffic, and it's maybe a 15-minute drive to the closest store. We see a lot of wildlife in our yard, which is only about 5 acres that we own. There are wild turkeys, armadillos, coyotes, and of course the deer. The plot we live on used to be an old grape farm, so there are a ton of ridges in the ground that used to be used to grow grapes. There's a herd of about 7 to 13 deer, plus some fawns that love to sleep in these ridges and eat the gardenias in the morning. We usually leave them alone and don't let our dogs or chickens out until they're gone. A few months back, I'd gotten into the habit of waking up early enough to drink my coffee on the back porch and watch the deer. They were usually most active around dawn after they woke up. After a while, I had noticed one that seemed like it would stare at the house very intensely, even when I was not outside. I would be in our computer room at the back of the house and feel eyes on me, only to look out the window and see this one specific deer staring down the house. But not from one eye, from both, like it was looking down its nose at us from its front set eyes. My mom would see it too, and it gave us the creeps. One morning, after I'd thought the deer had left, I let my dog out, a big black dog who'd roll over and try to play with a toad. He's very non-confrontational, but loves to chase birds and deer. If they don't move, he becomes disinterested because they're not playing with him. Our chickens just ignore him or flock around our small livestock dog. When I let him out, he spotted the deer and ran straight towards them, only to stop in his tracks 100 feet from them and tuck his tail. I looked and the odd deer was staring him down, once again from its nose. I called him back and he came and hid behind my legs. I looked at the deer, which had turned to look at me, and noticed that it was not a normal deer. Its eyes seemed a little too big for its head, and again its eyes were way in the front of its head opposed to more of the side like a normal deer, and its body just didn't seem proportional. It was a great mimic of a deer if you didn't look closely. But I have seen a lot of deer in my life, and this just wasn't one. It looked almost as if a deer had put on a deer skin over itself. It just didn't fit right. Anyways, we had begun the new habit of closing the blinds in the morning and waiting until the sun was higher in the sky to let the dogs out. After around 100 acres next to us was sold, construction began. We haven't seen any deer since the trees had been mostly cleared out, and I think it's for the better.
For our final story of the evening, unless you are a Patreon cult member, that is, a solo backpacking adventure turns terrifying as an experienced outdoorsman encounters a strange deer on a backcountry trail.
This actually happened to me when I was a fair bit younger, but a while back I was solo backpacking on an unfamiliar but really lush, kinda twisty little backcountry trail. I was using a lot of gear I had made from natural stuff, and it was early summer, so I didn't have any hunting licenses, and I didn't have a gun or anything with me. Literally, just a short celt I had made and a couple of flint knives. I had had a really nice couple of days of my trip, encountering nothing but pleasant weather, peace and quiet, and nature in all its glory. Then, on the third day, after I broke for lunch, I noticed movement on the trail behind me. I was carrying a lot of weight in a homemade triangle frame pack as a strength-building exercise, and I wasn't going all that fast. I thought at first it was a hiker, so I made a little effort to slow down to let them pass, but they never seemed to catch up. Eventually, that started to become irritating, and that was when I started to notice the movement just off the trail behind me. It was staying behind trees and bushes and around bends, and I couldn't make out what it was. Its silhouette was indistinct, staying behind cover, and I couldn't get a square look at it, but the more I looked, the more it looked wrong. The torso was weird, too long, no waist, and I couldn't make sense of the glimpses I got of the head. The legs were extremely spindly, and the arms were hunched up or tented in front of it. This was mostly on clay, and trails can be hard-packed ground on clay, almost drum-like. Sometimes you can really hear the thump of a footstep, but these were just erratic and so loud, like slamming a stick down onto the dirt. I called out to it a few times, letting it know the time for jokes was over, but whenever I spoke or yelled, it would just get quiet. Every once in a while, there would be a crashing sound from back around where I heard it, and a bunch of thumps. I kept thinking it was charging me, but then nothing, and a while later, I'd hear it again from a ways back. This lasted the full rest of the day, and by the time I was breaking for camp, I was starting to be pretty freaked out and pissed off. It was quiet while I set up my tarp and got settled, and as dark fell. I threw some stones behind me, mostly to settle my nerves, and it was silent, so I figured whatever it was over. When I cooked my food, I heard a few very rapid, very loud thumps from a ways behind me, and then silence. I was frozen over my dinner for a few seconds, and I could feel my heartbeat in my eyes. I looked back and put my flashlight beam through the bushes for a few moments, and then pretty high, like taller than I was expecting to look for eyes. I saw two retinas reflect back up, and then a bunch of thumps, crashing, and a weird, gasping, whistling, breathing sound, but like it was going into a big space in a big chest. I didn't get any sleep that night. I just sat with my back to a big tree and with means of defending myself in my lap. I was not feeling good in the morning, but coffee got me up and running, and I didn't see or hear any more sign of it for a few hours. I had been going west, kind of at an angle to the wind, and the trail I had met up with started going north, with the wind on my back. That was when I started to smell something awful, and I realized that I must be smelling it because it persisted no matter how long I walked. It was rancid, rotting flesh, or something equally gag-inducing, paired with a kind of musky stink. I've got a strong sense of smell, very strong, and it was making it hard to breathe. Not too long after I smelled that, I started to hear the rustling behind me again and the weird, loud, faltering footsteps. I still had no idea what it was. I kept getting glimpses of it, but couldn't make out color or anything definite. Could have been gray or brown or patches of reddish brown. Never got a clear enough look at it. I was really freaked out at this point, and I decided, stupidly, to charge at it a little to see if it would take off. I stomped and rushed the bushes a little, and I heard the rapid thumps and crashing again, and then silence again for a while. I am not ashamed to admit that it had freaked me out for long enough that I decided it was just time to put distance between me and it, and I took off down the trail at a fair jog despite the weight of my pack. I got clear of the stink for a bit, and I had been running hard for a while when my body decided it was a great time to vomit, so I did. I took a breather for a while and then started to really drag ass to my next watering spot, a little brook, and it was no fun at all. Took me most of the day to get there, and I ended up skipping lunch because I didn't want to stop. I ended up deciding to set up camp closer to the water than I usually do. I was determined to get some sleep, but still freaked out, so I decided to do something I wouldn't normally, and I set my hammock up really, really high at around 5 feet off the ground, with my feet a little lower than my body so I could roll out and land on them. I ate my food as quickly as I could and then climbed best as I could into my hammock and tried to be as still as I could. I started to doze off almost immediately. An important detail is that I keep my pack on another tree with my poncho over it and my bear locker in a food bag even further away, hanging in a tree. It had been drizzling for a few hours at that point. I don't know how long I slept before I was woken up by this bizarre, plasticky drumming sound, really, really loud, paired with the bizarre thumping and weird breathing, and the stench was back big time. It took me a moment to wake up fully, and then I was instantly in fight or flight mode. The noise was so weird. I had one of those little inflatable lanterns hanging off my hammock, so I flicked it on and I could kind of vaguely see around me the bushes and stuff. As soon as the light went on, the noises all stopped. Silence, long enough for crickets to start up their bullshit again. Then rapid steps, and the thing popped through the foliage into the little area I had set up my tarp and hammock, and I could see it more clearly for the first time. It was long-torsoed and thin-legged and moved lurchingly. A very weird head, too big for its body, and apparently pierced through with a branch or something. It had lolling arms outstretched in front of it, and I could see its eyes reflecting back at me, greenish yellow. I got that much of a glance and dropped down to the ground in my bare feet with my hatchet in hand. When I looked back up, I finally recognized it. It was a mule deer buck, covered in sores and dirt and skeletally thin, stumbling around on its hind legs and going from tree to tree, snapping at leaves or something else that just wasn't there. Its breathing was super ragged and weird, and its head was loosely floppy on its neck. As it got closer to me, it fell down, making the crashing sound it had made before, and then struggled back up. When it noticed me, it froze, pissed a bunch, and then took off into the bushes, still on its hind legs. I would have laughed if I hadn't been so relieved and tired. I went to inspect my food bag, and it looked like I hadn't tied it well, nor high enough as it was now on the ground, leaning against the trunk of the tree. It had had the ever-loving shit kicked out of it, too. There were bent and scuffed bits all over my bear locker. I figure the deer must have had chronic wasting disease or something, but Christ, did that fuck with me. I marked a few spots with sticks pushed into the mud so I could find the tracks in the morning, dried off, and slept for a few hours. I ended up searching around the place for a while in the morning, and it had already been muddy as I was putting up my shelter. Here's the thing. I found deer prints from where it had come in and left, but outside my clearing, from the direction I had heard it coming, I only found one print, a lot smaller than my feet, with a high arch and only 3 toes. And it was deep, deeper than my prints. I caught the rotting meat smell a few more times on the way back. I was supposed to go 2 days further in and then turn around, and I decided to just head back to my car. I actually heard the thumping as I was getting back to where I parked, and I ended up hustling the rest of the way. I skipped sleeping the next night and just walked through the night by flashlight because I kept hearing things too. To be honest, I haven't hiked on that trail since. Not sure I ever will without someone else.
That's all for tonight, dear listeners. Unless you are a Patreon cult member, where I've got a few more tales to make you look twice at the next deer that crosses your path. During the break, I plan to have several Patreon-only episodes to get you by until we return in late October. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other full Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the whispers in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at campfirecultpod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.